Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Gritty Hour. How you doing, Shawnee boy? I'm here with Shawnee boy.
What's up, T? Doing well. You know, always good to be here. Every single time.
And today we have a very special guest, Shawnee boy. I'm sitting with Patrick D. Wing, who's the author of the book Town and Country, The Architecture of James E. Ware and Sons.
How you doing, Patrick?
How you doing? Nice to see you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
James Ware is an architect operating what years?
He was born in 1846 and lived until 1918.
Okay, so he did a lot of the architecture, Sean, in our area up here in Dutchess County and in Manhattan. But you and I are both versed enough to know.
Yeah.
In Westchester as well.
Yeah.
And also in Long Island.
Okay. And Mohawk.
And Mohawk Mountain House.
Mohawk Mountain House.
Yes, correct. One of his more signature works.
So welcome to the Gritty Hour, Mr. Wing.
Thank you.
It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So yeah, you know, how did you get involved with this?
Well, I'm a Millbrook native. I grew up here and went off to California for a few years. I'm in the fine arts and graphic arts, and came back here after a couple of years in California. I've been working in the industry ever since, and it was something that since I was a young kid, I was really interested in a lot of the buildings that you see around Millbrook. When I was a really young child, I went to the elementary school, rather the nursery school at Bennett College. And so I was sort of surrounded by this architecture growing up. And in a lot of cases, it was a strange thing because it was ruins and things like that you'd sort of explore in the woods. And being a wing, you'd hear about Wing Road and the Wing Estate and Wings Pond and
Wingdale,
even Wings Castle, even though that's sort of a later thing. But, you know, I realized that somehow my family was connected to all these sort of buildings one way or another in Millbrook. And it took a long time for me to figure out exactly what that was.
do you know where the Wings, when the Wings first came to America?
Wings first came to America in, I believe, the 1600s, and they settled in Massachusetts, founded the town of Sandwich, Massachusetts. And then slowly every generation made their way to New York.
Wow.
And I believe maybe 4 generations later founded Wingdale, New York. And they were farmers, as were most people back then. And eventually, John D. Wing, who had the San Denona estate here in Millbrook, was a client of Ware's. But maybe I should go back even a little bit further. Eventually, when I came back from college one summer, and I read in the Millbrook Roundtable, there's an article by a gentleman named Christopher Gray, who was a part-time Millbrook resident, weekender, and he's also the architectural critic for the New York Times. And he wrote this article about various buildings in Millbrook, and that they had all been designed by James Ware. And I'd been familiar with Ware only as the designer of Halcyon Hall, Bennett College. And so reading this article, it was sort of an epiphany for me.
Right.
I realized, I said, you know, even from a young age, I realized that all these buildings were sort of connected by a common pedigree. And it turns out that it was basically this one architect, this man who designed everything.
Very interesting.
And so from that point on, I was completely obsessed, and you know, have been for decades, really.
That's very cool, because architecture that's not your background, right?
It's not my background. No, I'm in the fine arts, and but you know, the Wings are all sort of inveterate builders. You know, you're familiar with my cousin Peter. He has Wings Castle that he built,
right?
And then all, you know, my family, uncles, brothers, all in the building trades and that sort of thing. I'm just a guy who just carried lumber around a construction site. I don't really have much experience in that world.
But you're an artist yourself.
But I'm an artist, yes, exactly. And I figure, you know, it's sort of my contribution to that world.
What is your medium at the moment?
I paint mostly acrylic and canvas, and I, you know, sort of neo-pop works. I have, you know, sort of text and photography and collage and all sorts of things like that. And I do some traditional work as well.
Before the podcast, Shorty boy, I was telling Mr. Wing about Frank Bartow, the podcast we did a few weeks ago. The gentleman has the gallery right near where we're located. So, you know, maybe I'll hook the 2 years up.
Here in our humble village of Millbrook.
Humble little village of Millbrook, yes. Yeah. So that one article. Well, where did that appear in the Times?
That was in the Millbrook Roundtable.
Oh, you said that,
So
yeah.
I guess,
yeah.
him being the critic for the New York Times, and again, he was a weekend resident.
Mhm.
And years and years later, I contacted him when I was about ready to really start going forward with the book. And he helped me on one or two little things that just helped me think about things differently.
Oh,
About
so
it.
you met him and got to know him?
Actually, I'd only corresponded with him. But
Mhm.
He has a place called the Office for Metropolitan History.
Mhm.
And it's sort of, if you can't find out about it, they're the people to go to. It's sort of the last resort for sort of
Right,
architectural sleuthing and that sort of thing.
Right.
And the main thing was to find a picture of Ware. It was so hard to find a picture of Ware, his family.
Mhm.
And that happened down the line. And his suggestion to me was, well, you've tried the one branch of the family. How about you try the other branch of the family? And I'm like, oh, okay. And
Mhm.
it sort of made sense. And I was able to finally sort of, I feel, if I tried to go forward with something like this without the info of the family and pictures of the architect, I figured it just really sort of enlivens it. And,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Sure.
at one point I was just compiling information and I didn't really have a sense what it was going to go towards. And I
Mhm.
remember being at a party and we're up at the Dietrich estate.
Mhm.
And I was telling people about things I knew about it and said, well, how do you know so much about this? And my brother said to him, oh, my brother's writing a book. And I looked at him and I said, really? That's news to me. I don't know. I'm just interested. And he said, yeah, it's a book. You're writing a book. What else would this be?
Really?
So
So
I
you
said to
started this,
myself,
you started
yeah,
this
and
without
I-
the objective of,
Yeah, it was more just trying to find as much about it as I could. I was just sort of obsessed, from
Shorty boy, this is the gatehouse of he just said the Dietrich estate.
Is that, Patrick, that's the book you wrote? Okay.
This is the book,
Yeah.
and on the cover is what's called the gatehouse of the what's now called the Hitchcock estate. When Mr. Ware designed it, it was owned by Dietrich,
Charles Dietrich.
Charles Dietrich.
Yeah, that's the, I've driven by that. I've seen that.
Yeah, I know you have. Yeah,
It's a real landmark. It's one of the more sort of iconic buildings of Central Dutch.
It's very curious and mysterious when you're like, you're just thinking, what's behind that?
Very much so. Very much so. He was Dietrich was the founder of Union Carbide. And so you have a lot of these clients in Millbrook where I guess I should go back to where that starts. In 1884, he had a client named Henry Davison who established Altamont, which is the Altamont estate. It's at the highest point in Millbrook. And right across the street from him was John D. Wing, who they were partners in business. And Davison said, well, I want to build a mansion here, but I don't want to be alone. Why don't we get some of our friends to come up from New York and they can also establish country seats.
Mhm.
And so you have all these beautiful properties that kind of encase the village. And James Ware ended up designing mansions for all of them. So he's essentially the court architect for this group of these industrialists who had some roots here in Millbrook, but mostly in New York City. And they're competitive in business and competitive, but they were also friends as well.
Mhm.
So you have this sort of social and business overlap.
Now, did James Ware, as far as you know, get involved in the Millbrook, the architecture of those estates around here
Mhm.
prior to? Because he was also deeply involved in a lot of the architecture in New York City.
Yeah. He
Was it
started here-
concurrent or?
It was concurrent. He started in 1887 in Millbrook,
Mhm.
and he had been in business as an architect on his own since about 1875. He began designing very fashionable brownstones, mostly in the Upper East Side, and then he devised what is called the barbell plan. He was a very religious man, and he was very concerned with issues of the social responsibility of architecture for the lower working classes. You had the Jacob Riis exposés of really horrible living conditions throughout the tenement districts.
Right.
Ware's plan was what they called the vertical shaft. If you look at the blueprint of a building, of a tenement from above, when they're built side by side, what he did was put an indentation on the sides of the buildings so that it would let a little bit of light and air into
Right.
the interior sections of buildings that were formerly dark and airless, as it were.
Right, and that was one of the major causes of a heavy rate of tuberculosis down
Very
there.
much so.
The
Very
lack of
much.
sunlight.
Very much so.
So-
So his barbell plan was considered sort of a step forward, and laws were passed enacting that, saying the builders must enact these changes. The problem with it, though, is reformers said it was too little and it wasn't really enough. The problem is the shafts were too small, and sometimes in the event of fire, it would have like a dangerous flue-like effect.
Right.
They were also filled up with garbage, et cetera, et cetera. So it was sort of a first step that became ubiquitous throughout the city, but it was pretty quick where other reformers were quick to point out the drawbacks of the plan, saying it wasn't enough. The
Right.
real problem was the traditional lot size. And eventually what happened is they said, if you make the lot size larger of a building, you can put a giant interior courtyard in, and then there's light and air in every room.
Mhm.
But he'd only really fulfilled the programmatic demands of this industry competition when he first did this barbell plan. Unfortunately, it's come to be known pejoratively as the dumbbell plan. So, and it's the kind of thing that he's sort of known for mostly, and it puts him on the map as a reformer, but again, just sort of like halfway there.
Right,
It was a fair degree of controversy, but it also granted him quite a bit of early fame, and he was able to use that to pursue social causes in, with his church and through architecture for the rest of his career. On the other hand, he also had clients at the very, very upper end of the financial spectrum. All these, industrialists in Millbrook,
Mhm.
and most of his other clientele were actually quite well-to-do. So he had this sort of like, binary sort of practice where he's working for the poor, but he's also doing things for the very, very wealthy.
Mhm.
And he's also known for one of the earliest architects to use the Queen Anne style in America. And the Queen Anne style, when we think of Queen Anne today, it's the traditional Victorian with lots of shingles and dormers and towers and pinnacles and roofs and things like that.
Right.
Queen Anne collectively is sort of what we know generally as Victorian, broadly
Mm-hmm.
defined.
Which what I was just showing Shawnee Boy
Mhm.
kind of exemplifies that style.
Very much
correct?
so.
Yeah.
This would be a Queen Anne kind of combined with a baronial German style.
Right.
And he would combine Queen Anne with Renaissance and all these other different architectural styles that, anyone, in the day was sort of expected to work in these different mediums, according to different clients' demands and fashion as well, So in the 1880s, he was only the third architect in New York to work in the Queen Anne style. And this style just swept America. Like you'd see pretty much overnight, people started building like this,
Mhm.
So he's very much known for that. And then as well, he designed the Osborne Apartments on West 57th Street.
Mhm.
And it's considered only the second luxury apartment building in all of New York after the Dakota. And it's also,
I was
at
going
the
to ask you
time,
about that actually.
it's also at the
Yeah.
time considered the tallest building in New York. And they passed laws against it saying, until the Daley Law came, they said, we don't want any buildings going any higher than 12 stories.
Mhm.
The idea that a building more than 13 stories wouldn't simply collapse was sort of a real concern to New Yorkers
Right.
before the advance of structural steel.
And elevators were.
Exactly. So
Right.
elevators were the key to getting people of means. A very wealthy person wasn't going to walk up more than 3 or 4 flights of stairs, for
Mhm.
instance. So elevators is the key to sort of changing over from the single freestanding brownstone, which was becoming just untenable in a city like New York
Right.
with such less space and overpopulation. And so it was a way of luxury was the device by which they sort of lured well-to-do New Yorkers to live in an apartment building,
Mhm.
which was considered almost like a tenement at the point.
I understand.
It was a very alien notion. And the Osborne has what is considered the most beautiful lobby in all of New York City.
If you don't mind, I'm going to show
Certainly.
the folks while you're talking about the Osborne,
Mhm.
a photo of the Osborne. That's on it's 205 West 57th Street, Shawnee Boy.
Just a block or so down from Central Park. You can see in the photo, it's surrounded by nothing at the time.
So
At
that's
that
kind of
point-
the style that Mr. Wing is talking about.
Yeah, today, that's where the first modern residential building went up, is right by 57th Street.
Yes, there's a super, super tall one. That's
Yeah, now there's like 4 of them now, but that was the first one to go up.
buildings that, you think to yourself, what would Ware think of that? He was accused of building these buildings too tall, and you say, geez, these are nothing compared
I
to
know.
what we see today.
And look at the Hudson Apartments. Aren't they in the middle of constructing that
Yeah,
on
yeah.
the Hudson Yards?
I think it's a new type of construction that's something tube related, I want to
Is this the
say.
lobby of the Hudson?
That would be the lobby of the Osborne.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
And
meant to
again,
say the Osborne. Yeah.
It's considered the
Let me-
most beautiful.
you mind if I show this?
Oh, certainly, certainly.
This is
Please
from his
show.
book, Sean, and this is the lobby that he was just referring to.
Oh, yeah, that ceiling is immaculate.
Yeah, but look at the
Yeah.
rest of it. It's
Yeah,
It's sort of a
phenomenal.
symphony in marble and tile and stone, and
and
it still looks
where
like today.
he designed that with in conjunction with John Lafarge, a gentleman named Jake Maholzer, and the Tiffany Company as well.
Oh, really?
All really experimental glass back mosaics and things like that.
Yeah, it
And the beauty-
personifies that
The
period.
beauty of the lobby was it was sort of an enticement to sort of get well-to-do New Yorkers to say, wow, this is a really wonderful way to live communally. And it sort of replicated all the status and luxury of a freestanding home without all the expense and maintenance.
Right.
And so it's really sort of a new paradigm in New York, luxury apartment buildings. So luxury would be the sort of the mechanism whereby they would convince people.
And was that, did this just predate the subway? I'm trying to remember.
This would be 1883 to about 1885.
So right before the subway was
Yeah.
like a
Yeah,
decade.
they're sort of concurrent. I would imagine
Yeah,
technologically
like a
speaking.
decade later, the
Yeah.
subway.
Yeah.
But because I'm thinking, a lot of the money in Manhattan at the time was
Railroad money.
railroad money,
Yeah.
and I was going to say Wall Street.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
The developer of the Osborne was actually a man who had a stone cutting business. And if you see all the carvings on the outside, it was almost like the building itself was an advertisement for his, technical abilities and things like that.
Hmm.
So many James Ware buildings in Millbrook, New York, ended up bankrupting their developers and their owners. It's
Wow.
a consistent story throughout the book, is that the fabulousness of all of this, somehow people just went a little too far and maybe didn't understand operational costs afterwards, whatever it was, but it was this constant thing where it was almost like the architect was almost blamed for being super fabulous. And you say, well, I think maybe the clients have some responsibility in all this as
right,
well.
right.
It's like I said, in Millbrook, the interesting thing was you had all these clients. He designed 19 mansions in Millbrook for men who were in business with each other, but house building was incredibly competitive in the 19th century. It was sort of a status thing.
Mhm.
And you figure it must have been a real diplomatic thing for him to be designing buildings for all these men who were friends, but also competitive. And I said, every time the architect, anytime a client had outdone his neighbor, it just meant the architect had outdone himself.
Mhm.
So it must have been sort of a delicate dance of diplomacy he must have had
Yeah.
to sort of keep that established. I call the book Town and Country because there is a sort of real sort of parallel path of buildings that he did. A lot of country work like up here, and then these like things in New York.
Right.
Designed the first modern armory. He was very much involved in early fireproofing.
Mhm.
And so in many ways, the Osborne, although it doesn't technically get credit for it, could almost be considered the world's first skyscraper. You say that what's the first skyscraper in the world? It's almost an academic question. In 1883, everyone had this idea. But the fact remains, in 1884, while it was being constructed, it was the tallest building in the world
Wow.
at that time, and it was intended to be so.
Mhm.
And they kept sort of telling people, we're going to add a cupola, and we're going to add a roof, and we're going to add, pretty much just trying to tell people we're going to stay the highest and the tallest. So in many ways, it kickstarted this arms race of height
That
that
helps sell
determined New York City, the New York
Right.
City that we see today.
but the people that wanted to be in that prestigious place, that
Yes,
helped sell it to them.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the building itself was a success from the beginning. It bankrupted its owner, but the building itself was a critical and commercial success from the beginning, and has been ever since.
Yeah.
And so around
Is it,
1880s or so, I'm sorry, Sean, go ahead.
I said, the Osborne, is it still used as the same concept as it was 140 years ago?
It is. It's gone co-op, I believe, in the 1960s, and it's had several renovations. A lot of the apartments have been subdivided, and it's very popular among the world of opera and theater, with Carnegie Hall being right there.
Right.
And they claim that the building was claimed to have absolute soundproof construction, which may or may not be true. There's a story in the 1950s of a neighbor listening to another neighbor playing the same piano notes over and over again all night long,
Mhm.
and they complained about it. And it turned out later on it was oh, what's the name of it? Leonard Bernstein composing West Side Story
Wow.
right in that building. So
Interesting.
you figure next time your neighbors are making a little noise, you never know, they might be coming up with an American masterpiece. Who knows, right?
That was still,
Imagine,
Yeah.
yeah.
so Sean,
And
go ahead, I'm sorry.
so did you have an expertise in architecture before this book or because of this book?
I do not. I guess if I would say if I have any now, it's strictly from this book and just. But the one thing I'll say is, being as obsessed with as I am about this or have been, I feel like I gave myself a pretty good overview of architectural history from the time across the board, and
Mhm.
it's sort of like, I guess that's sort of the gift to me from doing this. I sort of feel a great sense of edification about just living in general. But my background is in the fine arts and printing and things like that. And again, it was just sort of a convergence of circumstances that got me sort of excited about this. Again, also Ware having um, a Wing family member as a client. Ware designed 6 mansions for John D. Wing in Millbrook. Only one of them now still survives. And so, it's sort of a culmination of things that I remembered from when I was a child. And then I look at it as I wrote the book that I was looking for that didn't exist when I was a kid.
Mhm.
And so I feel it's kind of like a full circle. It's also kind of just a love letter to my hometown here as well.
Very nice,
So
yeah.
it's been very, very, very gratifying.
Before I ask the next question, Sean, Mr. Wing was just mentioning about the wings. We were talking before about the wings, and he mentioned Wings Castle. You should know at one time where Wings Castle is, and next time you come up to Millbrook, I'll show you it. Overlooks the Millbrook Winery, and to a certain extent, Orvis, which is that gun range.
Yeah.
At one time, that was all Wings Farm.
Yeah.
Including the winery and the gun club.
Yeah, I guess they started the gun club. It's the first private shooting preserve in the U.S.
All right. Am I saying it right?
Or Sandinona.
Sandinona.
It's a little confusing because the name of the state was Sandinona. Then they had the Sandinona gun range. When they had a name, they really liked this and used it.
Yeah. And then I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was going to say, and then Mr. Wing was mentioning Wingdale. And this brings me to my question, because one of the chapters in your book, which is a phenomenal book, by the way.
Thank you.
And I recommend it to anybody who wants to learn, anybody out there that wants to learn about architecture or history, especially New York City history. I highly recommend this book. But there's a chapter that talks about Wingdale. And originally New York City was looking for an updated version of Sing Sing.
Yes.
So maybe you can explain to Sean and the peeps how that came to be.
Well, they were looking to upgrade or replace or something in addition to Sing Sing Prison, and they proposed a lot of places that really just would not be acceptable. They wanted to put in what is now Bear Mountain State Park, and people said, "Well, no, it's too." Even then, they said it's too beautiful here. Why would you do something like that? So eventually, they decided on Wingdale, and the construction was it was not by Ware. It was by a competitor of his, sort of a rival, gentleman named William Beardsley, who's known for the Thorne Building in Millbrook, which is being restored now.
Right.
And there was so much graft and corruption and delays, etc. They just said, forget this being a prison, just turn it into a hospital, and we'll move on.
Which it then became. Sean.
And then it became the state hospital through the years. It's been through there.
Right.
And so what ended up happening later on is James Ware's son, Franklin Ware, became state architect of New York. And then he went to design a prison in Great Meadow up in Comstock, New York. And it was also, again, filled with graft, corruption, kickbacks, etc. Proving that government is just as corrupt back then as it is now, generally speaking. And it became sort of an architectural scandal that actually destroyed his career. He resigned as state architect, and then a year later, as these things always do, that's sort of when the comeuppance came. He was actually arrested and charged along with the superintendent of prisons, the construction company behind it. It turns out that they were all eventually acquitted. Their cases were overturned. They said they never should have been brought in the first place, completely politicized, and they were able to sue and sort of get financially compensated for it. But his career at that point was over.
Right.
There was no way to sue it.
Right.
And I think it may have been, just sort of payback for crossing swords with an old boys club in Albany and that sort of thing. But it's sort of the one sort of section of sort of society scandal, as it were, that did sort of,
And did that eventually, the project itself, eventually evolve into what's now Rikers Island?
Rikers was another prison that Beardsley was overruled upon by Franklin Ware, and Franklin Ware ended up designing it himself. So there could have been sort of professional jealousies and things like that involved.
Understood. Okay.
Again, he was only the third architect to ever hold this position of state architect. Before then, there had never been a real sort of overseer of of these kind of state projects and things.
Mhm.
And so I think early on, some of these other architects like Beardsley may have felt a little encroached upon, saying, we've been doing fine all this time without some sort of architectural cop looking over us, as it were.
Right.
And so it is sort of growing pains, as it were. It was a bit of a smear to the family firm, as it were.
Mhm.
But the fact that he was eventually acquitted and cleared their name must have been some satisfaction,
Mhm.
I'm sure, to the elder architects. At
Right.
least.
And he also built, going back to James Ware,
Mhm.
was also the 12th Regiment Armory.
Yes, it was where Lincoln Center is now,
Mhm.
and it was considered the first modern armory in New York.
Right, you had mentioned it before.
James Ware had been too young to serve in the Civil War
Mhm.
by 1 year. He'd only been 17, so he was a member of the 7th Regiment National Guard. And the day after his 17th birthday, he was witness to the worst riots in New York City history.
The New York City
3
draft
days
riots.
in New York City
Yeah.
draft riots.
Mhm.
And some memories of that must have been very much in mind when he designed this armory
Oh, wow.
20 years later.
Mhm.
Class warfare was still alive and well, seeing that all armories were built north of 61st Street at the
Right.
time. So it was, rather than downtown and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
But, he had sort of the entire family had a real devotion to militia causes and the military.
Mhm.
It may have been almost compensatory, having not seen service himself. He sort of really doubled down on really helping the military and the armories and the militias and things like that for
Felt
the rest
some
of his
sort
life.
Obligation, sure.
Yeah, so it may have been sort of over compensatory in his
Mhm.
case, but his devotion was considered genuine.
Yeah.
Nonetheless.
What part of James Ware's, like where in the chronological part of his productive wheelhouse, so to speak,
Mhm.
would Mohawk come into play?
Mohawk, he started working in the late 1890s, about
Mhm.
1898, pretty much when he was pretty much finished in Millbrook. 1890s, a majority of Ware's work was in Millbrook. This
Mhm.
was sort of his oyster. Like I said, he designed 19 mansions, and for each estate, there would be multiple barns, outbuildings, guest houses, garden follies, things like that.
Mhm.
And he designed a lot of just neighborhood houses in the village and municipal buildings, schools,
Mhm.
churches, that sort of thing. So Millbrook was really sort of his oyster, as it were.
Right.
And I make the case in the book, Mohawk had been developed since the 1860s. And I said, well, Ware's additions, how did that come about?
Right.
And I found a photograph, it mislabeled, but it was actually a picture of the Smealy family with John D. Wing, somewhere in Millbrook. I can't really tell where the mansion, it's on a porch.
Uh-huh.
And you can tell they're sitting there, and it's very much a host and guest situation.
Right.
You can tell just from the photo. And it had been mislabeled as being just the Wing family. And knowing what I know, I said, wow, that's the Smileys right there. And so again, it sort of set off the idea of like, well, there probably was some connection between these two Quakers who both have these hotels. Wing had the Millbrook Inn in Millbrook, which a lot of the estate people invested in.
Right.
They also invested in Halcyon Hall as well
Mhm.
as a hotel,
Which is now Bennett College.
now Bennett College, and
Yeah.
it's what brought a lot of people to Millbrook in the first place.
Mhm.
Mhm. So I think there definitely is a connection between Ware, Millbrook, and Mohawk,
Mhm.
and he designed.
Can I pause you for a second? For the average listener, Mohawk, like I don't know what that is right now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I should talk about that. It's a place called the Mohawk Mountain House in New Paltz, New York, not far from here, and it's considered one of the classic sort of iconic luxury resorts of the 19th century.
Is there a golf course there?
I'm sorry.
Is there a golf course there?
Yes, there is. I was told one of the earliest ones in America, apparently.
Yes, actually, I am aware of it. I'm a golfer, so I'm aware of that golf course. Yeah.
But yes.
So you've definitely heard of it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I think if I showed you a photo of it, Sean, from Mr. Wing's book, it might, especially if you've golfed there before.
Yeah, it's a very iconic place. Walt Disney actually was inspired by quite a bit of it for not just the look of some of Disneyland, but also the concept of seeking a higher class of clientele. Like at Mohawk, it was run by Quakers. There's no dancing, no card playing, no alcohol. In recent years, they've kind of relaxed these terms because, otherwise they probably wouldn't.
My first thought was, why would you go?
The golfing.
But it's right on the, is it right on the Hudson?
No, it's actually in New Paltz. It's just
in New
past
Paltz.
just past New Paltz,
Okay.
just as you go out of town. So not that far away, really. And the whole thing about Mohawk initially was the natural beauty. it's the scenic expanse there is considered on a par with any of the national parks. Just really,
While
really
you
beautiful.
talk, I'm sorry, while you talk, I'm gonna show people a photo of it from your book. But you can continue talking, I just wanted to.
And it's surrounded by two nature preserves between them that are forever wild, and it really has this kept the sense of the Victorian age.
Yes, I actually know an older gentleman who worked there as a teenager in the 50s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He's telling me
people work
yeah.
there, very family oriented. Multiple generations will work there, of people whose fathers and grandfathers and grandparents worked there and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
In fact, the architect's son, Arthur, that's where he met his wife in that sort of storybook setting there.
Really? Arthur Ware?
Arthur Ware, yeah. Franklin and Arthur were both his sons. They joined in the 1890s, just in time for the Mohonk project. Arthur Ware was considered sort of the prodigy of the family, and he won a scholarship to the École des Beaux-Arts in France, which is the national institute of art and architecture and painting and things. And so if you're an American who went to the École des Beaux-Arts, you come back to America, it was a very, very prestigious thing.
Nice
And
to have
so-
on your resume.
Yeah, very much so, very
Yeah.
much so. And Arthur was sort of very popular in the world of theater and, very, very sort of very social character. And a lot of, at that point, a lot of the commissions they got started to come from his connections in the world that he was in. So
Mhm.
you have this dynastic tradition as well, at him handing off the business to his two sons.
Right.
And
And that was, what did he do that in the 1890s?
1890s, he kind of
Yeah.
transitioned. Yeah, his
Yeah.
sons kind of, it was a small firm. They only ever had maybe 2 or 3 other draftsmen working for the company, as well as the senior architect and his sons.
Mhm.
And in this age, at least in the 1800s, this was before the era of modern blueprinting and graphics. So if you had to have multiple blueprints to give to, say, the plumber and the stonemason and the carpenter, they all had to be drawn by hand.
Right.
So it was a very much, very labor-intensive sort of process.
Somewhere in his book, you did mention, I was looking for, you were talking about Arthur Ware in France.
Mhm.
And there was something in here about Arthur Ware in Paris.
Yeah,
Was he responsible for anything out there?
he was just a student there. He was
Just a
just a
student,
student
okay.
there. But he came back to America completely in love with France. And in fact, he would joke to his sons, our name is really Delaware, as in Delaware, as it were.
Ah,
But it turns out there's been some family research that says that actually may be true.
is
And
that
it's sort of a
right?
joke.
Well,
that there
there's
may
your
have been a connection.
there's your follow-up book,
There
Mr.
you
Wing.
go. There you go. I
We
was
want to
wondering what
know.
next.
We want to know.
Yeah, so it's funny. I know almost as much about the Ware family history as I do my own.
Yeah.
And I know
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
maybe more than I need to know about my own.
Well,
But,
actually, both, when you think about it, the Wings and the Wares are one of the founders, in one sense or another, of the Millbrook area.
absolutely, I would say
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Between the Thorns, the Wings, the Davidsons, they essentially paid to have the town built. I mean, it was sort of a small railroad town.
Well,
farm
it was
locale.
actually Dietrich that brought the railroad to the town, correct?
Well, I think it was a gentleman named George Hunter Brown initially,
Okay.
but they all invested. They
Yeah.
all, it's what kind of brought everyone here,
Mhm.
and they sort of invested in the railroad. They invested in a lot of the small towns in the village.
Mhm.
Dietrich in particular, he came from Germany and was really trying to recreate the world of his childhood in Bavaria. He came to this country literally penniless,
Mhm.
but he was a protege of Davison, who had started Altamont, and his son built Halcyon Hall.
Mhm.
A guy named George Hunter Brown,
Mhm.
who was the head of the railroad. It changed hands a lot of times. I'm reluctant to say the name of it because I'm afraid I'll probably get it wrong. But
Columbia and
actually-
Dutchess.
that would be it. Yes, he actually named his mansion Millbrook. So technically, he was the real founder. But that was almost a generation earlier than Dietrich and the other farmers.
Right.
They kind of came here and turned this sort of small, quiet farmland, and it became quickly fairly upscale as these gentlemen came and devised mansions.
Yeah, it used to be called Hart's Village,
Hart's Village,
which I
yeah.
think was when it was mostly a Quaker town.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
Hart's Village. There was a place called Mechanic up by the meeting house. And so they kind of consolidated. A gentleman named Haight was very smart to come along and turn his farmland. He started laying out streets because he knew that the railroad was coming. And so he bought up land around his farm, started laying out streets. One was named Franklin, one was named Merritt. And the town kind of grew from there.
Yeah,
from
well, that was
there.
one of the designers was Franklin Merritt.
Was it?
He
Okay.
was a very modest guy.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
named one road after his
After
first
himself.
name. Another road.
After himself, yeah. Yeah.
And they're still named the same today?
Yeah, we're sitting on Franklin Avenue
Yeah.
as we,
Okay, okay.
Wing and I.
It's Millbrook's Main Street,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. It's impressive is, so you told a story, the Wares and all these gentlemen that you mentioned in 1884, they all came up and they built their mansions and they pretty much created a trail from Millbrook to New York that still exists today.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's almost akin to people sometimes refer to Millbrook as sort of like the Hamptons, or Northampton or whatever. Ware actually did quite a few buildings down in the Hamptons as well. He kind of like after he was sort of done with Millbrook, he kind of moved on to there. A lot of these things happened concurrently. But as it stands, Ware worked in Millbrook from 1884 to 1914. So
Wow.
you talk about a 1930, 30
James,
years.
James Ware did,
James Ware.
and his sons,
His sons didn't really do too much work independent. Anything done in Millbrook was by the senior.
by James.
He
Okay.
seemed to have him and Dietrich had almost like a very akin to the Renaissance sort of relationship between patron and artist.
Mhm.
Over a long, long period of time, they were talking about they were going to build a castle, and so everything at the Hitchcock estate, the Dietrich estate, was supposedly supposed to be temporary. That they were all going to tear it down and build some mythical castle, but it turns out that Dietrich liked his mansion. He said, "Well, I'll keep it." And so they were building continuously on the estate everywhere.
Mhm.
And it could very well be, I'm sure there were designs or plans drawn up, but it could very well be just the architecture that we do see there is sort of what spun off from their sort of rhapsodizing about this mythical Germanic castle that they were going to design.
Right.
But if you go up there at all, if you ever have the chance to, it's closed to the public, so it's a little difficult. But you can see even the barns and the farm that he built was supposed to be the ramparts just for his castle.
Mhm.
And as you drive by now, you look at it and you do double take and say, "Is that a cathedral over there?" I mean, it's
Yeah,
just amazing.
yeah. I've been fortunate enough to be on the property.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
beautiful. It has a very Bavarian, Germanic sense.
Yes, it is. It's like you called it before, like a fantasy.
Very much fantasy inspired. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in the 1960s, it was a headquarters for Timothy Leary,
Yes, that's
where he had his residency up there.
the newer generation would know it as that.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's called the
it's-
Tim Leary House.
Now it's called the Hitchcock Estate.
Yes,
which is,
yes. And,
but- Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh, well, I was just going to say, at the time when Leary and his crew first went up there, they were all sort of psychologists and academics and sort of very quiet and respected. And they slowly went from that kind of approach and that kind of language to more of a religious thing where they became gurus and they were talking about, and so it sort of like turned off the people who said, well, these were respected academics. Now they've just gone crazy. They're
Yeah.
just,
Well, that's what happens when you take drugs.
it's one of the side effects, they say.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the side
Sean's ready to say, "Damn kids today."
Some things never change, Sean, right? Right.
Uh,
But believe it or not, though, you talk to a lot of the people here who were around during Leary's era, and they said, we didn't really have any trouble with them. They were generally polite when they'd come to town. That they were,
mhm.
they were accepted, just like anyone else. It was really the raids and the police crackdowns that really kind of created a lot of the problems until they were driven off the property.
Yeah, G. Gordon Liddy, you may know him from the Watergate era, the Nixon administration.
Mhm.
At the time of Timothy Leary being here, which is mid to late 60s,
Yeah, 64, 68.
he, G. Gordon Liddy was the district attorney for Dutchess County.
Oh, okay.
So he was the one that instigated the raid initially, I
And
think.
he would go on the raids himself and that kind of thing. I mean,
Yeah.
he was real sort of.
Well,
gung-
because he heard a newspaper was going to be
He
around.
was a gung ho character. This was a couple of years before Watergate, before he became one of the White House plumbers there.
Mhm.
And it's funny you said that they're filming a movie now based on the White House plumbers,
Called the White House Plumbers.
called the White House Plumbers here in Millbrook.
Yeah,
Liddy actually lived in Poughkeepsie as well.
I'll give you insider information about that
Okay.
offline.
I've got a few things we could say offline about that as well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
Why-
it does have a storied history though, Sean. So,
very much so. A lot of
Yeah.
people associate it strictly with the Leary era in the 60s and things like that. But
right.
even as a child, I heard about those things, but I was always just more excited about the architecture in this place. It seems sort of like a ruined park almost.
Yeah.
So
I was going to say before about I think James Ware, like, did he his wheelhouse of production, did that predate Andrew Carnegie? And
I
Migdale
think it did.
Castle?
I think it did.
Okay.
Migdale, I believe, is 1927.
Okay,
1927 or so. Although there was a connection between even the Carnegies and the Wings. For instance, in World War II, the San Donata Mansion had been closed for years because the Wing family was much more involved with the shooting preserve at San Donata.
mhm,
And the younger generations didn't want to upkeep the mansion and things like that. But in the 1940s, during the war, Mrs. Carnegie would stay at the open San Donata Mansion in the
mhm.
summer times rather than going to Scotland. Usually she would go to Scotland to summer, but they were afraid of possible Axis bombing and that kind of thing,
Mhm.
even though it never happened in Scotland, but they were afraid at the time. So she would spend summers in the Wing Mansion in the 40s when
Oh,
the
really?
war was going on.
And
So
not in Migdale?
not at Migdale.
Oh,
No,
good.
no.
Just so you know, Sean, and whoever's watching or listening, we have what is in effect a castle here in Millbrook called Migdale, which was built by Andrew Carnegie for his daughter.
I believe so.
And I
yeah.
think it was an exact replica of his castle that he owned in Scotland,
Yeah.
as Mr. Wing was just pointing out.
I think
It
it's
must,
Ebo Castle. Possibly.
It's a point of contention in modern days because they do have plans to repurpose the castle now, which has supporters and opposition, but that's the way life goes.
gotcha. Is it, do people tend to do aerial flyovers of Millbrook because it's got so many different architectural?
I don't know if
I'm
I've
not
ever
really
seen
sure.
any.
I've seen a few. A gentleman who lived in the Dietrich Mansion had a few old photographs of aerial shots and things like
Yeah.
that.
Mhm.
But I myself was sort of looking at just on Google Earth and seeing the old railroad line that goes through the Bennett campus and along the golf course right into the village. And I thought to myself, if they develop that park down there, they're talking about tearing down Bennett College. And I said, that would be a perfect little thing to have like this little sort of rail trail connecting the park in the south of the town to the park right in the village. And I believe they may be going along with that plan. So maybe someone heard some of the little seeds I planted there.
No, that's
Trying to
good.
say,
I hope they do. I know it's supposed to lead right into the Franklin Avenue, so.
Yeah. So once again, you have sort of like the railroad bed as the sort of the entrance to Millbrook. Once
Mhm.
again.
Another tidbit, which I may have mentioned when we were talking to Mr. Manzi about some of the history of Millbrook, Sean, was given Mr. Dietrich, he invented the gas light,
Acetylene.
acetylene.
gas. Yeah.
And we were the first, this village here, Millbrook, was the first in the nation to have, or was it maybe even
I
in the
believe-
world?
I think it was the first, and the light plant was up where I believe Grace Church is now,
Yes.
next to the Thorn Building.
Mhm.
And it was only around for about 20 years because it wasn't long before electricity came along.
Right.
So you had this sort of like 25, 30-year period where street lighting was from acetylene gas, which Dietrich, he didn't invent it, but he pretty much popularized it for its use. And this was sort of a boutique model to demonstrate what you could do.
Right. That's what he did it for. Yeah. To
So-
show other people how it would work. But it
And
was
it was-
state of the art for its
It
time.
was state of the art for its time, and it was also, people thought it was a gift, but it was really a business. He actually convinced all the village homeowners and shopkeepers to let them bury lines, and then they would light up their places with gas.
Mm.
And then I guess must have been 1910 or so, thereabouts, there was a giant explosion there,
Mhm.
and a gentleman almost lost his life.
Mhm.
I guess the building blew up, and it blew him out of his clothes, literally.
Mm.
But he survived, and it sort of just showed the sort of the obsolescence of the gas age, the quaint sort of gaslight age, kind of came and went.
Yeah.
And
It
they
had a
say
small window.
you still find like when they dig pipes, occasionally people dig, they'll find the old gas lines from
Sure,
over 100 years ago. And and then him and his son founded a bunch of companies that eventually became Union Carbide
Mhm.
industry titan. So you had the Carnegies, you had Standard Oil, you had Union Carbide. So all these guys are all really pretty much the captains of industry of their day.
Yeah, I had mentioned to him, to Shawnee Boy, or whoever's listening, Millbrook is sort of like now I can't think of the name of that show that was on the History Channel. The
Made in
men-
America? Yeah, something like
A
that.
lot of them lived here in Millbrook or had homes here anyway.
Yeah, it was sort of like a vacation place.
It was a vacation place for them, yeah.
You know?
But I was gonna ask you, Mr. Wing, in terms of James Ware, and his architecture, because there was an influx around that time of Italian immigrants
Yes,
who were mostly Masons.
yes.
And did they tie into Mr. Ware's architecture?
Very much, very
Yeah.
much. his preferred builder was a company from Cornwall on Hudson,
Mhm.
Mead and Taft. And Mead and Taft generally supplied all the workers.
Mhm.
And most of them were Italian, most of them were stonemasons. And the majority of them, believe it or not, came from one small village in Italy
Fundy.
called Fundi.
Yeah.
And they would tell, they'd come here, they would find work, and they would tell their family back home, we have plenty of work. Come on over. They need good masons. And with Dietrich in particular, all those stone walls, all those buildings, the building was continuous, it was around the clock.
Mhm.
And Dietrich basically said, if you need the work, I'll supply the work. And it was a real boon to the immigrants who came here. Dietrich himself had come here as an immigrant, and he had a very much an affinity for the immigrant classes who came and worked on his estates. And they did everything. They did Bennett College. They did all the estates. And so you see
I'm
the
proud to
stone-
say they did the foundation, at least the foundation of the building was sitting in right now.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, the other story about that as well is a lot of these Italian stonemasons came, they worked, and then they decided to stay and start businesses of their own,
Yeah.
have families of their own. And in fact, you'll see different houses they designed
Mhm.
that look like mini warehouses.
Mhm.
They could say, well, I don't need an architect for this. I've done this before. I can do this. But you can see where it's almost like sort of paid tribute to sort of the way that an architect would do things, and in their own right became builders and that sort of
Right.
thing. So you see, he had kind of an effect on the immigrant classes.
And I've been
The
told if
unintended.
you go to Fundy, which I've never been there, in
Mhm.
Italy now, a
Mhm.
lot of the same family names that are here in Millbrook are prevalent there in Fundy.
Yeah,
It's very close
Yeah.
ties to one to the other.
very much so.
And
You
I'm-
see
I'm-
it generationally how people come to this country, they struggle, and they kind of make their way, and then they slowly.
Right.
It's just the story of America.
Would it be safe to say, like the projects that James Ware did here in Millbrook,
Mhm.
a lot of the labor was
Absolutely.
those immigrants from?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Almost all of them from a company, Mead and Taft,
Right.
who were builders in their own right, but they were his preferred builder in New York City, as well as all of his work here, as
Okay.
well as Mohonk as well.
Including the Osborne or?
Actually, not the Osborne. I don't
Mhm.
think. I don't. I think the Osborne had their own builders.
I see. Okay.
Osborne being a stonemason, he probably had his own. But
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Yeah.
so you have this sort of connection between the builders, the people who work for them, the architects themselves, and
Mhm.
again, you sort of see how it moves upstate and spreads out.
Yeah.
And families start building their own things, make their own companies, and that's the story of Millbrook. You
Yeah.
sort of see it
And-
still.
And those immigrants were all master craftsmen.
Master
They were
craftsmen.
probably master craftsmen before they even got off the boat.
Absolutely. My
Yeah.
guess would be if you were going to do that kind of work, that you would be selected for these projects in particular because of your skill. Some of the stonework at the Dietrich estate in particular is just astounding. You'll see sort of things done in fieldstone that look like they would have been carved. Just sort of just arcane facility these people had with stone. They
Right.
really were like master artists and artisans, really more so than just even workers. It's really true.
Right.
Um,
Well, I'm late to the game in terms of living here in Millbrook.
Okay.
I only moved up here. I lived in the Bronx as late as 2010. So,
all right.
but I have fallen in love with the history of this town,
Mhm.
and I love how your book, Town and Country: The Architecture of James E. Ware and Sons. I love how it ties the history of this town together through James Ware's work with New York City,
Mhm.
which is my hometown.
Yeah.
And Sean also lived in New York City. So this is the beauty of the book for me. And I think anybody who has a love, as you do, Sean, of New York City history. Sean is a history major.
Okay.
In fact, Sean is a teacher of history, correct?
Really?
Yeah, well, not this year, but for a long time, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
He does have a love of New York. And I think anybody who does have a love of New York or Millbrook would definitely do themselves a favor and buy this book, which I know is available on Amazon.com, and you'll see a
Yes.
link to it just below this podcast.
I'm about to launch a site, jameseware.com, where the book will also be available.
Okay.
Um,
All
And
right.
as far as, again, the point you make about New York, it very much is the case that, you have this connection. All of these gentlemen who came here, some of them had local roots, but a lot of them were from New York. And there was sort of a conscious decision to come here and make this sort of a colony or an enclave. And the architect himself sort of, remade this town sort of in in their fashion, sort of reflect their particular, sort of views and sort of the pedigree of styles, of buildings and houses that they wanted to live to reflect this town,
Right.
And so they took a very sleepy sort of agrarian locale and turned it into very much something like the Hamptons,
Yeah.
very much like
And
like
retaining a lot of the original charm of the area.
very much so, retaining the rural quality of it.
Which is sort of kind of like the genius of James Ware. Is
Absolutely.
he worked within the environment rather than change the environment.
Absolutely.
You
And
know?
like I said, a sort of very competitive thing. It must have been sort of a very delicate dance that he had to do to sort of please all of these gentlemen who were friendly, but also quite competitive. Nothing more competitive than house building in the 19th century. It was really sort of a thing where even your friend, you want to show him up by the latest tower or addition that you built to your house.
It's an uncomfortable position when your friend is buttering your bread.
Yes, yes. And somewhere you're between them and saying, "Oh, I'll make something nice for both of you." But you would even have like local shopkeepers who would say, "Well, okay, well, I want like to add a little tower to my corner store and things like that." So he had an effect not just on like the landed people, but also just on the locals as well. You can see sort of remade this town sort of in their image, as it were.
I forgot to mention also, you can probably, Sean, get this book in pretty much any bookstore, I would think, right?
I'm still sort of getting into bookstores. I think the pandemic kind of like got my sort of
Yeah, this came out right before.
just
COVID.
about a year.
You can get it on Amazon, I would guess, right?
It's
on
definitely
Amazon.
available on Amazon. You'll find the link to it right below, whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us on your podcast platform. There will be a link, hopefully to Mr. Wing's website, but definitely to the Amazon location.
Yeah, jameseware.com is about to drop any day now. And
He's got the newfangled lingo. See,
about to drop them. That's what they say about records, right? Music, right? It's about to drop them.
Yeah.
I was thinking of a needle dropping onto like a vinyl, as it were, when they talk about something dropping.
Yeah.
But and also my website is patrickdwing.com, where people can see my artwork, which is sort of the antithesis of the Victorian age. It's more of a modern sort of pop thing.
With your permission, I'd like to include that link.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I would be thrilled. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Tom.
Sean, I know you were interested. I could tell by your expression.
Yeah, I was just listening. There was like, I actually did not every year, but I taught some lessons on tenement and events. And so when you brought it up, I just let you talk. But like, I've actually taught lessons on with the kids when I did the immigration, how they lived, and like the only the one window and the barely any sunlight, and like, so like I connected to everything you were saying.
Well, a funny aside to that is laws were passed based on these innovations that Ware and other architects devised. But you'll see a funny thing in New York. I don't know if you've ever seen in some of the older buildings, you'll see inside a window to nowhere, like a window from the kitchen to or something. And the reason for that is the law stipulated you had to have X number of windows, but the law didn't stipulate that the window had to actually look out to outside. So it was a way for builders to sort of honor the letter of the law, but none of its spirit whatsoever.
Have you ever been down to the Tenement Museum?
I have not.
I recommend you do it.
Yeah, it's very much up my alley. I'm sure.
Have you been there, Mr. Boy?
Believe it or not, I almost took a few trips there. It just never panned out.
Yeah.
Meaning my principal, hopefully doesn't hear this. They only let like 30 kids go at a time, and he always wanted us to do like a trip of the whole grade.
Understood. Okay.
It just never worked out. And then I tried one time to be like, let me just take my home room. And he's like, nah, if you're gonna go, you gotta take everyone. I was like,
Right. Well, even if you snuck down there on your own, it's highly worth the trip.
I've heard very good things about it.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
A friend of mine used to be a tour guide on there. They started out focusing on an Italian family, and then they expanded to an Italian and a Jewish family, and now they have an Irish family.
And they
That
have
they focus on one particular family, and they take you into the tenement. And you
into
can.
the tenement itself.
So when you were describing the windows on the interior, it reminded me of that, because almost all of them had separation from the living room, and they had this one little room where the beds would be.
Sure.
And there'd be a window in
A
between.
window to nowhere, basically, in other words.
Yeah, and then
And it shows how it's one thing for an architect to design something, but it's another thing entirely what a builder is going to do. And you sort of had all these sort of competing sort of elements, as it were. People would blame their architect and say, well, I didn't tell them to build a window to nowhere. We said a window should go out. So they had to change the law. It says a window actually looking to the outside.
Right.
You know, you have this sort of unscrupulousness on the part of developers who want to get every dime out of it.
Well, actually, the propellant, as we discussed earlier in the podcast, the propellant of that law change was the prevalence of tuberculosis in the tenements down there.
But I mean, you know,
Sunlight, most of them. That was
I'm
the,
sorry.
yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, sunlight was one of the main reasons there was such a high rate of tuberculosis in the
Oh
tenements.
yeah, yeah. You know, it's like when your mom tells you when you're little, get outside. You need, you need sunlight. You know.
Breath of fresh air, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, they had
Yeah.
railroad flats. It would be room after room after room with no access to, air and light. In fact, Ware's barbell plan, to go back to that, he actually labeled it underneath. He called it light and air, was sort of his, the premise for the remedial solution.
Was he so would you say that he was an architect with the idea of reform in his thought process?
Absolutely. The dumbbell plan or barbell plan.
Yeah, which one is that the same thing? Because when I researched it, it's dumbbell.
Same thing. I probably should have maybe elucidated that. It was designed, he called it the barbell plan because if you looked at the floor plan from above, it was indented as if the barbell. But again, the plan was seen as not enough and people criticized it because it was sort of a solution, but not quite enough. Again, you'd have, there was a danger to some of these air shafts. They'd fill with garbage, and then if a fire, it could be a flu-like effect, So it was an initial step, it wasn't considered the entire solution. And so pejoratively, they started calling the barbell the dumbbell plan after that. And there's architect Ernest Flagg, who was a reformer like Ware, but maybe a bit more strident about it. And he published this landmark article where he decried the use of the dumbbell plan. And Exhibit A was his sort of Ware's drawing. But this was, 10, 20 years after the fact.
Mhm.
And, the laws were always very much behind the developments. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? They had to be kind of kicked in the pants to kind of pass a law saying we can design remedially in a way that builders will build and a landlord could still make a buck,
Mhm.
in sort of a very delicate sort of arrangement or compromise.
That makes me think that connects to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, right? And all the fire safety laws that got put into place after the fire happened and all that.
Absolutely. I guess it comes down to the debate at the time was the social responsibility of design, the social responsibility of architecture. And in Ware's case, he kind of felt sort of he felt misunderstood in the sense that he did this dumbbell plan because it fulfilled the programmatic demands of this design competition that he designed it for.
Mhm.
He was saying it's just a start. And so he kind of thereafter devoted himself continuously still to further innovations in tenement and apartment design, sort of as a way to reclaim his title as a reformer against sort of all these kind of brickbats were coming in saying, well, this isn't good enough and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it started a dialogue that continues probably, to some extent even today.
Well, I was going to say, if he was around today, he'd be considered a socially responsible architect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. At a
Before
time,
it was trendy, Sean.
yes, exactly. Exactly.
He's ahead of the curve. He's ahead of his time.
Yeah. It was before a time when these things were sort of like at the forefront of building and that sort of thing. But it came from the industry themselves. It came from architects. It came from plumbing designers. It came from hardware dealers and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That slowly you get progress. It just takes a lot of sort of kicking in the pants to make it happen.
Yes. The wheels of those things turn slowly.
Quite
Yes,
slowly.
Yes.
Quite slowly.
Well, Mr. Wing, thank you. This has been a very, very interesting, probably longer than an hour, but it was well worth it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you guys. Enjoyed it.
Shawnee boy, thank you, sir, for coming.
Yes.
Nice
And-
meeting you.
Yeah, very nice to meet you, Patrick. It's a pleasure.
If you don't buy this book yourself, I'll get it to you because you'll consume it voracious. Very.
Well,
Go ahead.
I'll get you the internet boosters for Christmas. You can get me the Town and Country for Christmas.
Well, maybe I'll ask Mr. Wing to sign you a copy.
Well, I was
There
gonna say, the book is sort of Millbrook centric in some ways, but it is also quite a bit about New York's history.
And that's what I
New York's
loved.
building
I loved
history as well.
the fact that both of them were involved. You know,
Yes.
I just couldn't drag my eyes away from it as
Yeah.
I was reading it.
Just don't want people to be fooled by the cover because, like I said, it's quite a bit of New York as well.
There's a lot of New York City history. Those of you who are listening or watching that have a love of that, I highly recommend you purchase this book. And again, I thank you for coming by,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Wing.
Thank you very
That was
much.
great. And
Thank you.
Shawnee boy, you take care of yourself,
Take care.
and we'll see you on the next Gritty Hour episode.
All right, T.
Okay.